Hello, everyone, and welcome. Join us as we cross the Himalayas and march south, along with the spirit of history, of world history, and enter the magical region of India. We find ourselves along the Ganges and the Indus, nestled in the Narmada Valley, which is where I find myself nestled right now.
Yes.
Hello, Philip.
Hello, Ahilleas. I'm nestled in the spirit of India, where the mind resides.
So yeah, we finished Hegel's account of China in the previous episode, and now we've made our way to India, which is the second moment of Hegel's lectures of world history.
Indeed, second chapter. It's the second civilization, nation, or state that he looks at, and we're going to see what he has to say about India.
Yeah. So I guess one of the first things to note is, unlike China, which Hegel often characterized as being very self-contained and unreceptive to externality, Hegel's sort of in the introductory paragraph to India, Hegel quickly points out that India has been receptive toward the rest of the world, and thus it appears as an effective link in the chain of world history. Thus, all peoples have turned their attention to India to find a route to it in order to access its treasures. And so I guess that's one important distinction, that where China was entirely focused on itself, and the development of China seems to have been merely externally influenced, but that external influence never fundamentally changed what it was for China to be. The Indian civilizations seem to be much more open to external influences, making fundamental changes to what India is. Mm-hmm. That's what I'm getting at.
Yeah. Yeah, it just seems much more open and receptive, it seems, at least according to Hegel.
Yeah.
Berkeley.
Yeah, and so we get to the first section of India, which is the principle of India. And I think this is a very tricky little sort of concept to untangle. So Hegel writes that India appears to be a land of fantasy. And this idea of the Indian subjectivity with fantasy is a very big one for Hegel. He repeats it a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And it's strange because the German word is Fantasie, and I went to Hegel's philosophy of spirit, called philosophy of mind, in the Wallace translation, and I tried to find Hegel's account of fantasy in there. I thought this is a sort of a kind of, it's a mode of subjectivity, so it should be there. And Control F, and I found some instances of fantasy. So what's interesting is that fantasy is not a section on its own. Mm-hmm. It's just a moment of cognition, of theoretical cognition, of theoretical mind.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's interesting that Hegel is sort of aligning this entire moment in world history, the subjectivity of this entire moment in world history, with a moment of cognition that he doesn't even deem to be significant enough to sort of merit its own section.
Yeah, so does that mean that is fantasy the same as imagination, or is imagination kind of its own thing and then fantasy is a subset of something else?
That's a good question.
You didn't think it's Control F that one, did you?
No, I haven't done enough research to figure that out. So imagination is its own moment, it has its own subheading in the philosophy of spirit.
Yeah.
Let me just read a bit from page 174 of the Philosophy of Spirit. So, Hegel writes, cognition is genuine just insofar as the intelligence actualizes it, i.e., posits the concept of cognition for itself. This formal determination has its concrete sense in the same thing as cognition does. The moments of cognition's realizing activity are intuition, representation, recollection, etc. These activities have no other immanent sense. Their purpose is just the concept of cognition. Only if they are isolated is it then imagined, firstly, that they are useful for something other than cognition, and secondly, that by themselves they provide cognitive satisfaction, leading to a glorification of the delights of intuition, recollection, fantasy, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, even isolated, i.e., mindless intuition, fantasy, for example, can provide satisfaction. But true satisfaction, one admits, is provided only by an intuition permeated by intellect and mind, so on and so forth. So, fantasy permeated by intellect is true satisfaction. Fantasy that is isolated from intellect is a sort of imagined satisfaction. It's what we might imagine might be satisfying. But really, if we think about what cognition is, we find that it's not really satisfying.
Yeah.
So fantasy is not this... it's a kind of mode of theoretical mind that can be either exercised in isolation to the intellect or in accordance with the intellect.
Mm.
And it looks as if Hegel is picking out the idea that fantasy in India, ancient India, is isolated from the intellect. That seems to be what... that seems to be the sort of the similarity.
Yeah.
But one would have to do much more research into the philosophy of spirit, I think, to really get a fleshed out idea of what's going on here.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. This sort of very meager category, fantasy, is playing such a substantive role in Hegel's account of India.
Indeed. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting and really good of you to bring out that it is. And also we see here the kind of contrasts with regards to how Hegel's talking about fantasy here and how he's talking about it in the section on cognition from the philosophy of spirit, where it seems to be much more in a sort of epistemological vein. But what we see here in India, from what I was seeing, is that why sort of we have this sort of fantasy is because we have a lacking objectivity.
Yeah.
Yeah. So whereas in the cognition section, it was lacking intellect, here the correlate seems to be objectivity.
Yeah, I agree. That's right. Yeah. So then that raises a further question. Are these things meant to be correlates? Are we meant to think of intellect and objectivity and fantasy and subjectivity as sort of similar? Or is Hegel's account of fantasy here not connected to his account of fantasy in the philosophy of spirit?
Well, I think that indirectly they do tie together, and in a non-philosophical sense, fantasy is just a kind of like it's what we normally take it to be. You just have an image of something that you're transfixed, or you just keep it in your head or whatever, and it has no sort of impact on your life or your actions or whatever. But usually fantasies do precisely have that impact, right? So
yeah, I guess it's that. Yeah, I guess the point is that they're not constrained by objectivity.
How do you mean?
So, for example, he writes, in India, no object is inaccessible to poetry and fantasy, for fantasy transforms each one and makes it wondrous.
Right. Okay.
And the idea I got from this was that the the movement of determination is from the subject outwards, not from the objective world inwards, and certainly not mutual self-relation. And so what I take Hegel's point to be regarding fantasy is that it's sort of unfettered subjective influence and transformation of the world.
Yeah. So it's in that sense, it doesn't matter, what deity or word you use to call this or that natural phenomenon. You can switch things out as you like. There's no restrictions there, right? And so there's kind of, you could say there's no friction.
Yeah, I guess so, yeah. But this is all still very vague, I think, and it remains vague for most of the section. It's not entirely clear what the practical implications are of India being the land of fantasy.
I think we do get a sense towards the end of the section, like very end. Yeah.
Okay, then.
And we do also get intimations of what's the fallout, in the sense of like, Hegel says some pretty strong stuff at the beginning here, right? He says that the regulations and laws in India are devoid of what is ethical, sociable, or moral, and the content consists of superstitions, right?
Right. So why would Hegel say that if he thinks that it is the land of fantasy?
I think that's what he is after, is the kind of root determination of why things are the way they are. Like, why are these laws so and so, and are these regulations so and so? And maybe he finds that it doesn't trace back into anything that's has any more like has no conceptual weight. It only has a kind of subjective or fantastical layer to it.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. So where with ancient China, we saw that the ethical and the moral was entirely bound up with the individual, the emperor. Here we sort of see the opposite. You sort of have a pantheism of ethical and moral.
Yeah, although there is also the issue that, well, how can you call laws and regulations devoid of being ethical and sociable? That doesn't make sense. That is a incoherent thought. Laws and regulations only have existence insofar they are affecting some people in ordering their behavior in some way, and so they must be ethical in some respect, and must be sociable in some respect, must be moral in some respect. Otherwise the society wouldn't be there, wouldn't survive, right?
Yeah,
so
that's the point.
It seems like, yeah, Hegel, I think it maybe is going a bit too quick here.
Yeah. So right. So I mean Hegel obviously knows you can't have laws that are not ethical, sociable, or moral, right?
But just as a practical matter, right?
Exactly, yeah. Exactly. I mean, maybe it's the objective aspect of them that he thinks is lacking. And he's just being very summary in
And
how he
yeah, Yeah. And with the objective aspect, I suppose, conceptual justification.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So moving a bit further down, yeah. So what's nice about this section is how often Hegel compares it with China.
Yeah.
Which helps to sort of contextualize the differences that we're sort of meant to trace.
Yeah.
And so he writes, the Indians do not have the same sort of superstitions that the Chinese have, for their entire condition can be summed up as one of dreaming or fantasy. We've already said that. Rationality, morality, and subjectivity are nullified or cast aside, and thus the human being is simply self-absorbed and arrives at something positive through the vagaries of the imagination. The extremes are, respectively, wild imagination involving sensuous enjoyment and a totally inanimate abstraction of inwardness. The Indian vacillates between them.
Yeah. And you would think that initially India would kind of prove to be like the dialectical response to China, whereas the Chinese have strict law and morality, and that implicitly depend on an individual. The Indians kind of turn it around and focus fully on individuality, that everybody gets to pursue their own subjective thought and so on, and then the laws and regulations come second to that.
Right. And then on the other side, you have what I imagine is Hegel's description of some kind of Buddhism. So when he writes, total inanimate abstraction of inwardness.
Right. Yeah. You have that.
That's sort of that's the other side of subjectivity.
Yeah.
Where you just sort of you're no longer applying subjectivity to the world and transforming it accordingly, but you're instead receding into your subjectivity and sort of resting entirely within it.
Yeah, but both of those routes seem to me to be like both extremes of subjectivity.
Yeah, exactly.
You either cast, and the entire world in the sort of veil of subjectivity. Every natural thing has or phenomenon has a kind of spirit or God or deity, right? A superstition connected with everything. Or you just blanket it all out and say, well, no, this is just the void or the beyond, or kind of like all of this is an illusion, like the world of phenomena is not real, etc. There's a reality beyond that, and so on. And both seemed like extremes of subjectivity. But then Hegel seems to say that subjectivity is also nullified here. Why? Guys, it's like you can't win anywhere with
well, I guess because proper subjectivity needs objectivity. I don't know.
That's just it's too sloppy. You can't just say we need some. In China it was like, oh yeah, you don't have enough subjectivity. In India, oh, too much subjectivity. Yes, but it's not the proper subjectivity. That's just like that's not an argument.
Oh God. So
it's like, make up your mind, Hegel. What is it's like he's figuring this out on the go.
Well, I guess it's sort of two extremes, right? It's either you have like extreme objectivity, where you just have external forces at play, and extreme subjectivity.
Yeah.
You just sort of have whatever's inwardly manifest is what matters.
Yes.
And I guess both of these are deficient, and neither of them are properly themselves in so divorced of the other.
Yeah.
right? I mean, that kind of makes sense, right? I'm not just
Yeah,
pulling that out of my
but
ass.
but that's us reinterpreting, like interpreting Hegel here, right?
Yeah,
So
sure, yeah,
trying to make sense of it, and I agree. That seems the most sensible of what we have so far, and that China sort of begins in immediacy. And well, what is immediate in terms of experience? Well, it's what's there, objects, right? Stuff. And we deal in the realm of stuff, right? Of the mechanics of the economy and so on. But then all of that is kind of ignoring the reality of the mind. Well, what is the mind? And the Indians seem to go into that direction, trying to figure out, well, what is the mind? Well, the immediacy of the mind is such that it makes everything wondrous. It has this creative, poetic excess, but it also has this creative, poetic, complete annihilation of everything. Like, because you can just as you can imagine and think of wondrous things about anything, you can also nullify it. You can nullify everything to the point of complete abstraction. And I think
exactly,
that
yeah.
this is a kind of exploration that doesn't happen in China, right? Because they never step into the subjective element as subjective element, whereas it seems like the Indians are pursuing that actively to the detriment
Yeah,
of the objective side.
yeah,
Like,
exactly.
never
I
mind
think
the
this is
state.
what,
It's just like let's just focus on what is this.
yeah, I think that's exactly what I think that, like you said, that's the best, that's one of the best ways to make sense of this. I mean, these are lectures, and this is why the world needs us, Philip, to make sense.
This is why the world needs you to make sense of it.
So, and then I guess just continuing on this thing, this theme that there is an absence of objectivity, or rather, objectivity is subordinated to subjectivity. Hegel writes, in the case of the Indians, in contrast, there is no thought of history, of chronology, or the presentation of an actuality. For them, all that subsists in the present evaporates into colorful dreams. So whether or not that's true, I don't know. But again, the point is that by having a history, you are putting down in black and white objective events. You are creating a causal chain of why things happened, not according to how you willed them to happen, but how they actually happened.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that Hegel thinks that ancient India doesn't have the kind of history that we spoke about in ancient China, again, sort of supports his point that it is a civilization where subjectivity, where fantasy is sort of master.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and going back to China, to use that as a contrast, yeah, it seemed that history there was very much kind of record keeping.
Yeah. So brute objectivity, really.
Yeah,
So just this happened and this happened and this happened.
yeah. Well, it's if thinking back on the three forms of historical thinking, it's kind of like the immediacy of history, right? Or that Hegel mentions there. So, like the first step is just to report what happened, and not really think too much about why, and make sense of it in a conceptual scheme, but just this and that, just logging events basically. And I think you need to log events because otherwise you cannot build the concept, the conceptual understanding from that unless you have a log. You need some record, right? Whether that is archaeological or otherwise, some material you need to work with.
Yeah, exactly. And that is apparently absent in India.
Yeah.
Then I'd like to move on maybe to paragraph 2, where we get a golden nugget, basically. Hegel finally gives us some logical explanation of the move from China to India.
Yeah.
So he writes, the next step from China to India is a necessary advance, one that indeed generates a world of inwardness. Hence, the fulfillment is the coming into being of an inward world. For the Chinese, the world of thought exists only in relation to the state and to utility. The next step is for the determinacy, heretofore posited externally. So in China, the determinacy was posited externally to become inward, to configure itself into a spiritual world, such that what is inward not be merely abstract, such that spirit construct from itself a world of its own, and the world be configured into an idealism. So really, it's in India that idealism is first invented, understood, created.
Yeah, although he then goes on to say that this idealism is one of sheer imagination, devoid of reason and of freedom.
All great things must start somewhere.
Yeah, indeed. No, yeah, that's a very helpful thing to point out. Another thing that reminds me of is Aristotle's concept of friendship, right? It begins with utility. You meet people, mechanically because you're in the same place or you need each other for something. But then why you really hang around with them is because they give you pleasure. Then I think the matter becomes something inward, not external, right?
Yeah.
It's like we're following the same sort of pattern here.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, the main takeaway from this is that Hegel is identifying this necessary conceptual movement from this purely external relation of thought to the world to a relation whereby thought actually idealizes the world. It goes out into the world and makes it thought-like, but purely in this sort of fantastical form. What is objective appears as spirit's imaginative constructs, but as non-conceptual and accordingly as unfree.
Right.
So unfree because it's just spirit sort of latching onto the world and transforming it into the way he wants it to be, rather than some sort of mediation with the world where sort of each is given its view.
Yeah, that's good. It's like it's only superficially kind of interacting with the world.
Yeah, exactly.
But then in the third section, if you're okay with continuing.
Yeah, please.
He talks about how there is a unity, a oneness of the concrete existence of what is external and what is internal. So what do you make sense of this, Ahilleas?
Yeah. So what is it? Is it can you which part exactly is it that you're looking at?
Oh, it's just this sort of subsection 3, just to be in the beginning, the first sentence.
Right. Yeah. I think the clue comes towards the end where Hegel writes, accidental phenomena are not separated from essential being. And so I think there's unity of what is external with what is internal is still, I think, on the emphasis is on the internal movement, on subjectivity. And it's sort of a one-sided unity where subjectivity unites itself with objectivity, but doesn't sort of but it's uniting with objectivity is not, is not as a means of sort of understanding objectivity is the wrong word, of sort of giving objectivity its due. It's sort of just its way of expressing itself in objectivity.
No, I think understanding is apt. There's a lack of understanding.
Okay. Right. Yeah, there is. Yeah. So it is a unity, but I think we might say it's a one-sided unity or a formal unity. those kinds of terms.
Yeah. On the other hand, this very telling, this idea that you haven't yet separated substance from accidents.
Yeah.
Right? Because if you're unable to recognize what is substance, what is substantial, and what is accidental, I mean, you're in real trouble. Living in a world where you can't tell the difference between these two super important categories, right? It's a world where just like you know, you can't tell the difference between fantasy and reality in a way, right? It's like being in a dreaming existence or a drugged existence of sorts.
Yeah. And I think the reason why Hegel thinks they can't do that is because because recognizing that distinction requires you to sort of let go of your subjectivity and to look at objectivity as objectivity. And only by doing that can you understand what aspects of it are substantial and what aspects of it are accidental.
Yeah.
You can't figure that out through your own subjectivity.
Yeah, maybe a more helpful way to put it would be to say that, you know, you gotta let go of the things that you've been told or the things that people believe, right? Because that's basically all what this boils down to.
Mm.
People believing certain things, and you know how things actually work. You gotta suspend those ideas or beliefs in order to start looking at things and doing stuff with them, right? I mean, this is kind of like how scientific development goes in Europe, right? It's like, no, we know how the world is. We are at the center of the universe and so on. Like, it's not, we're not lacking ideas or notions or pictures of where we're at and how we make sense of things. It's just that those things we've made sense of, we actually haven't made sense of what touches reality. We've only made sense of a kind of superficial thing.
Mm.
It's like with Kant, right? When you look at when you just observe how the sun moves, it does seem like we are standing at the center of things and the sun just goes around us. But we need to make a shift in our head that no, this is how it looks like to us that when we are going around it.
Yeah, that's really,
but we need to let go of a certain element of how we view the world there. And I think this is what you maybe meant when you said we need to let go of this subjectivity, this kind of prepackaged, unquestioned, uncritical subjectivity. But why? I mean, it feels good to be at the center of the world, right?
It was great.
This is the deceptive thing about subjectivity. It is a way on and a step towards our freedom, but it's also a pitfall. Like, we can get stuck into it, like, because it has this alluring quality, like dreams and fantasy do, right? They are kind of brought into being as enjoyable, pleasurable things.
And I guess also because it emanates from us, it just feels right and correct.
Yeah, that's another thing. It kind of has an implicit ownership attached to it, right? You feel as if you you created this, even though you maybe didn't, but it feels as if you did because your subjectivity is part in generating this dreaming or this fantasy.
Yeah.
So it comes with that feeling of agency, which is extra deceptive, right?
Oh yeah, completely.
Not only do you not see the world for what it is, but you don't even see the thing through which you think you see the world is itself has a kind of mechanism where it tricks you into giving you agency when you actually don't have it.
Yeah. Well, you don't see yourself as how you are.
Yeah.
In engaging in this kind of thinking.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's why Hegel hammers really hard on this.
Yeah.
Because of where it leads us to.
Very good. Excellent stuff, Philip. That was a lovely little detour.
Yeah, but it's all because of you. You opened the path.
No, but you brought the walking boots to take us up the hill.
Yeah, but you showed me there was a hill to go up, right? Without you, I just thought I would have just been going through the valley.
Good. Okay, and then Hegel talks. So I think just on this point about accidents and substance and not being able to distinguish between them.
Yeah.
Hegel writes that the ancient Indians take up sensible stuff into the universal.
Yeah.
And this stuff is expanded so limitlessly that the divine is bizarrely swallowed up by it and itself made to be ridiculous. So I guess here again, the idea is that because there is no distinction between accident and substance, where substance, I suppose, would be the universal in this kind of example, and accidents to be the limitless sensible stuff that are sort of put into the universal, that the Indian imagination, Indian fantasy sort of incorporates everything that it finds around it into its dreaming world. Its subjectivity transforms everything, regardless of whether it is substantial or accidental, and makes it part of this world.
Yeah, yeah, and that makes sense, you know, from if we're starting from the ground up, right? Because you have this world of phenomena which we see and hear and touch, right? But if we're going to imagine, like, you know, a divine realm, then the divine realm has to be this but better, right? It cannot be anything less than this, because then it wouldn't be wouldn't exist, right? So it has to be this but more, right? So instead of, you know, beings with just 2 arms, you have beings with 18 arms, because that's how much better they are. That's how much stronger they are, right?
Yeah.
You just pile on the sensuousness, just crank it up to 11.
I guess it also speaks to the way that subjectivity approaches objectivity. It just sort of takes it as given and doesn't sort of investigate it. And because it just takes it as it is, the thought is, as you said, it must be like this, but just better.
Yeah.
It doesn't, there is no sort of finding the spiritual in the objective. It is spiritualizing the objective as it is and just elevating it.
Yeah, it's like with Hume's account of infinity, right? It's ridiculous. You're just like, oh yes, we have a pile of finite stuff, and you just augment it to infinity. No, exactly, you don't. Yeah. You just pile on. You just get a bigger pile of finite stuff. You don't get infinity that way.
Yeah. So we've got the bad infinite here.
Pretty much, yeah. Which itself is a hint of the real infinity, right? Because that's at the root of things, which makes all of this possible in the first place. But it's not made explicit. Yeah.
Then he says some other stuff about Indian religion. Maybe it's worth, I don't know how much we should spend on it, since we're going to talk about it eventually in more detail. I don't know if you have anything in particular to say.
Well, I think that just to kind of, as I think a guess of where this is going to go. So we seem to have 2 things going on in India, right? We have, with regards to the divine, right? On the one hand, there is this huge excess and ecstasy and expansion of, you know, multiplying the sensuous, you know, in a extreme manifold, where everything is like super fantastical, but still on the level of the sensuous, right? So there we are, kind of importing the objectivity into subjectivity, or kind of putting the particular in the universal, whichever way we cash it out. And, you know, we think we have something divine, but really we just have a bigger pile of finite things. So that's one way in which this goes.
Right. And just to go back to your example, and so divinity is understood as not having 2 arms, but 16 arms. So
Yeah.
it's the piling of the finite is just making what we already have as finite as having more things, thus giving the appearance of divinity.
Yeah.
Right. But not
Because,
really being properly divine.
but well, it wouldn't really be a qualitative difference. And so it doesn't really make sense to call it divine.
Mm-hmm.
It's like nothing is really different between us, like us and these deities, as there is just like a difference between us and the dogs and cats, right? There is an increase in some prowess or mental capacity or strength or cunning, what have you, but there is no qualitative shift. And so really it's kind of slides back into all just being the same world anyway. So it's a kind of self-undermining sense of divinity.
Right, yeah. So heaven also sort of comes down to earth in this respect.
Yes, in a weird way, but losing then heaven. It stops being heaven proper.
Exactly, yeah.
But
then you had a second point to make that I cut you off out.
Yes. So that we're just giving our reflections on the implicit of what this logic sort of implicitly leads us to, but from the front it's just this manifold and everything is fantastic and beautiful and empowering, right? Because who would want to live in this world where we have all these deities? Seems like there's an order, there's action, there's adventure, there's drama, there's so much that's going on. Mm-hmm. But you get to such an extreme with this kind of down this path that you generate a dialectical response, and that dialectical response is to nullify everything, go against everything that first world view is generating, and just do the complete opposite.
Right.
Which is going to be the nullity, right? It's going to be the abstraction, the beyond, right? None of this phenomena stuff is real. There is a reality beyond that, we're all trying to attain to, right?
Yeah.
Which is more the Buddhist vein.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. I second that prediction of where this is going to go.
But I think these two things are connected, right? You get the one through having this manifold explosion.
I mean, but they're also connected in their emphasis on subjectivity, right?
Exactly. Yeah. This is happening in and through the activity of subjectivity. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Or the exploration of subjectivity that kind of India undergoes.
Glorious.
It's very glorious.
Okay, shall we move to the region of India?
Sure, go on.
So this is sort of Hegel's brief account of the geography of India. And as with the account that he gave on China, there isn't really much to say. It's a bit difficult to flesh it out. But I guess, again, the important thing, geographically speaking, for Hegel, is that the ancient Indian civilizations emerged in these fertile valley regions.
Once again, yeah, easy land.
So, yeah, exactly. So, again, sort of Hegel is sort of pointing out the importance of being able to of not having to constantly fight against nature, of living in an environment which is bountiful and which gives you the time and the means to develop a civilization.
Yeah. Gives you the time and luxury to, make all these fantasies, make all these theologies and ideas and figure things out, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Takes time to do those things.
Precisely.
Yeah, I don't think we need to say much more about the geography. Hegel is kind of very superficial on that level.
Yeah.
He does say some principal things, though, later on, further down the section. And that is when he kind of compares the states.
Yeah. So he talks about political life, ethical life, religion.
Yeah. So in point 2, he continues this theme of external internal, right? So I'll just read the whole thing. For the Indians, there is indeed a unity of external and internal, but one in which neither does the nature constitute an understandable whole, nor does what is spiritual stand free as free will over against this natural domain. Instead, there is still immediate unity. Lacking is the spirit's withdrawal into itself, whereby it recognizes the law of freedom as subsistent for it. So the principle of freedom is lacking, and so lacking too is will subsistent in itself, as well as in the form of subjective will. So I think, as you said earlier, these are kind of like subjectivity here must mean the kind of proper subjectivity that matures later on. So everything necessary for a state is lacking. This is a key point, right? Therefore, in India, there can be no state whatsoever. In China, the state is everything. In India, there is just a people, but no state.
So there's a bit of a tension here, because he's being slippery again with his terminology.
Mm-hmm.
Because obviously he has to think that there is a state. Otherwise, we wouldn't be discussing this moment in world history.
Yeah.
We need to have the organization of a state to have all the kinds of moments that Hegel deems as pertinent in the stage of world history. So when Hegel says there can be no state whatsoever in India, he doesn't mean state in sort of the brute generic sense. He's clearly talking about something particular. And the fact that he then contrasts it with China, where the state is everything, suggests to me that Hegel is sort of saying there isn't that objective aspect of the state that we saw in China. Instead, there is this sort of subjective state in India, which is lacking the subjective aspect, which is what makes it so unstate-like.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about
that? It's hard because on the one hand, you do have Indian kingdoms that rise and fall, right? There's a lot of history with things happening in India for a long time, and some of these kingdoms turn out to be very sophisticated. They support an advanced priesthood. They make pretty sophisticated architecture, right? So there's a lot of organization happening in India that could not have happened without a proper state kind of functioning beneath all of that. So I'm a bit puzzled. It seems like, I don't know, maybe something is it missing in Hegel's account that doesn't accord with the historical record. On the other hand, we are looking here at the conceptual account, right? So the embodied temporal state of being, be what it may. We are interested in the conceptual determinations here, the structure.
Do you think maybe it's
I'm supposing that it's to do with how maybe different kind of bonds and ways of being and organizing amongst people, families, is more pertinent rather than having a separate state organ or apparatus that does things. So maybe the weight is on different elements. Like that seems to me it has to be the case, right? Because it's surprising that Hegel doesn't speak of the family here.
No, he doesn't talk about family. Because it seems to be about schools.
Because if you devalue the state, then you must value either civil society or family more, right? And my guess is that the family is valued more in this case. And so that there's more sort of organization and effort put into the family, and that the family is in charge of being kind of the fundamental determination for things, ethical, moral, etc.
Yeah.
Not the state, not
The
the king
next
or the emperor.
the next section is called the castes.
Yeah.
So that could be where Hegel starts to explore or flesh out what is actually what is the basis for people's mode of being in the absence of a heavy-handed state.
Yeah.
I guess this must also be connected with the fact that Hegel sees India as the land of despotism.
Yeah, he has very nasty things to say about the when I say the eastern part as a whole, right? He's not just talking about India, but even also lumps China, Persia, right?
The Turks, Philip,
Middle
the
East.
Turks.
A lot of the things are kind of brought into that umbrella.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
Yeah,
go on. This is an
sons
important
of
point.
despotism. Yeah, I think it's important because, so just to write, just to say what Hegel writes. So these sort of Asian areas are breeding grounds of despotism. If the ruler, the one holding power, is an evil ruler, despotism becomes tyranny. But then tyranny is known to be an objectionable condition, something individuals detest, an extraordinary state of affairs. In India, however, there is no feeling of one's own freedom, no consciousness of what is moral. So tyranny is in order and is not detested. The Indians are left with nothing but the feeling of the sensible domain as a given for them.
Mm.
So, one idea is that because there is no state in the sense of objective relations between a government and its people, there aren't these external relations that we saw in China. So in China you had the emperor, you had the mandarins, and you had sort of this pyramidic structure of power sort of gradually going down and being exerted across the country, sort of controlling what's going on. That doesn't seem to be the case here in India. And I think that's why we have a certain despotism.
I would say something else.
Okay.
I read that differently.
Go on.
So I think that the issue is not that there's lacking an objective framework, because that seems to be in place. Otherwise, why is there a despot? Why is there a tyranny? I mean, that suggests there is some sort of objective state in place. But what's lacking is on the part of the person meeting that state, they don't have a consciousness of their own freedom. And so they can tell what is good and bad, good or evil. They are just meeting this confronting this thing and taking it just as sensuously given. And if it hurts them, physically, if it causes pain, that's bad. But apart from that, it just is what it is. It's a part of nature. It's there, right? I don't know anything better because I don't have a sense of myself as a free being. So I think that's the element what's lacking here.
That's a very good point. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Is the despotism also connected, though, to the fact that it is the land of fantasy and subjectivity? So for the ruler, it is whatever their subjective world happens to be that determines the governance of the state.
Yeah, it seems like we can't tell despotism apart from order here, because we don't have a criterion. No. A concept of freedom.
Which in some respect is very similar to what we saw in China, though from the other side of it. I mean, there's an interesting correlation here because in both cases, in the case of the emperor, it was the emperor's particular ethical, moral standing or viewpoint that determined what everyone else took as their own standpoint. And that was seen as potentially dangerous, because if the emperor wasn't a good emperor, then that would be bad for the state. Here, it's a bit different. The emperor, the ruler, isn't the fountain of everyone's ethical and moral code, but their particular standpoint is again what is essential, what is important for the governance of the country, of the state. And I wonder if that's where the lawlessness and the despotism comes in. It's a subjectivity, because subjectivity is what is the focus, what is essential.
Right. So maybe could it be right to say that we don't really have a clear distinction between law and lawlessness, because both are bound up with subjectivity?
Exactly. So
and
just as the emperor,
subjectivity does, it just becomes, the case.
Exactly. So just as the Chinese emperor could feasibly do whatever he wanted, because his will was the ethical code of the state, the tyranny of subjectivity in ancient India sort of leads to a similar situation where you cannot tell the distinction between order and despotism.
Yeah. Although it seems like in China there was more resources, more criterions in place, because you could distinguish the law from the emperor. It's just that whenever the emperor did something different from that law, well, then the automatic merger was enacted, where, well, then we just update the law according to the latest events as the emperor, right? But there's still a sense that there is a law separate from the emperor.
Maybe, yeah. And maybe that's the difference that between the sort of that the ancient Chinese state has more clear objective structures. Relations are more obviously external. But I mean, we spoke a lot about how the will of the emperor is identical to the law of the state. So maybe formally you could distinguish between the two, but really they were in a kind of identity.
Yeah. I guess also as another point, these are ancient times, right? Life is rough.
Sure.
And
we're not expecting any.
The reason any kind of state, I think, is in existence at this point is because it maintains itself through force, both force against external enemies and internal ones, right? So I think we shouldn't be looking down on this ancient state because of it's not free or whatever, but that was the rule of the day, right? The ancient empires is just rife with this kind of stuff. And if anything, Hegel should maybe focus more on that element of force, keeping things together. It seemed that was doing much more work in the Chinese account, whereas that is just like kind of left aside in India for now, at least. Maybe he picks it up later.
No, obviously you're right, and that's true. So no, we're definitely. I mean, no, we're not looking down on that. It's I mean, the sentence that we just quoted about 10 minutes ago is very much written from our perspective. This idea that tyranny is known to be an objectionable condition, something individuals detest. This is the ancient Greeks, the Romans, us. We take it as objectionable. So yeah, definitely, I take your point. Should we conclude with Hegel's very interesting final sort of a point in section 3.
Okay, yeah, what was that?
So the idea that China doesn't have this, that the Chinese state doesn't have this organically articulated structure, but that the Indian state begins to have it. And so, so let me just read it out. So what China lacks is the feature according to which the idea of the state is concrete in subdivisions, internally determined and organically articulated as distinct domains. There is no abstraction, as in China, for what there is instead is the being of the distinctions posited on their own account, albeit in such a way that they exist by means of the whole and the whole by means of them. These distinctions are something universal. They are universal particularities. The entirety of the state is something substantial. However, in particularizing itself, it divides itself into multiple particular occupations that constitute the organic branches of the state. These are the distinct elements that we see emergent in India. So India, unlike China, is the beginning, the emergence of an organic conception of the state, where you have distinct branches of the state, but where each branch is a means of the whole, and the whole is a means through these distinct branches, much like an organism, right? Where things are not just means for ends, but are related to the whole in their being means. In China, we didn't have this.
Yeah, but on the other hand, he also says that they are more independent. They stand on their own, which suggests that they are less organic in the sense of like they're less like behave less like organs and behave more like, you know, cells, that they are self-sustaining, functioning units within a bigger whole, but they could just drop out of that hole and just be by themselves.
Does he say that? Where does he say that they're independent?
Be posited on their own account. Okay, well, never mind. Okay, yeah, I take that back. He doesn't put that forward. He does emphasize the interdependence. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's actually, you know, Hegel is seeing something distinct happening in the Indian state, which again is interesting because we just talked about how he doesn't have a state. So we're gonna have to understand how these two things go together. But
I guess we'll find out next time. I mean, this is kind of a teaser more than saying anything substantial at this point, right?
Yeah,
he kind of gives us a view of like, yeah, there's a big difference here, but I'm not telling you what it is.
Yeah, you're gonna have to read on. Indeed. Okay, I think that's all I have to say on this. Philip, any further remarks?
I think that's really interesting, the thing he said about despotism and tyranny, right? People's like, it seems like you can tolerate despotism quite okay, but not tyranny. So he makes a difference between the two.
He does, yeah.
But you shouldn't also be able to tolerate despotism. And the fact you're able to tolerate it means that you're lacking a consciousness of freedom, both for yourself and as an idea, right? And no wonder, because we're dealing in the immediacy of history, right? We don't start out, human history doesn't start out knowing all the concepts and answers. It has to figure them out through experience, which we will see is a bit of a mess, bit of a slaughter bench.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
The fact that Hegel is able to say, we don't have a feeling of one's own freedom is because we've gone through this process. We are looking back, as you were saying. But the fact that we're able to look back is because there's been this huge development.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And who else? But what else could we also be tolerating now that we shouldn't be tolerating? It's because we're lacking a certain consciousness of something.
Yeah, very possible. Let's not remember that all these shapes are logical shapes, right? So they can occur at any point in time. They don't necessarily have to follow this chronology.
Well, sure, but I think once you have developed the later stuff, you can't go back. It's like once you step into essence, you can't go back to being.
I think you can.
Only by pretending you can go back. You can go back by losing it.
Yeah, exactly.
That can happen. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. In that sense.
Like if they we decided let's just burn the internet, destroy all the servers, and burn all books. Sure, we'll pretty quickly regress.
Well, not if we decide, but also, if we're invaded by another country, or our own leaders decide to.
Yes, some other country decides that yes, our government is just made up of a bunch of Nazis, and they need to come do a special operation to liberate us from ourselves.
For example.
Exactly.
For example, that would be a regress.
All right, yeah, we're off to a good start with India then.
Yeah.
Interesting stuff.
I think it's going to be really interesting.
See a clear advance. Something new is popping up in India that
yes,
isn't happening.
Exciting.
Yeah.
And so I salute you all from the fertile Narmada Valley.
And I salute you all from the overly fertile imagination of the ancient Indian peoples.
Okay then. Well, bye-bye. See you next time.
Cheers. Bye-bye.